If dairy is something that you would love to eat, but you can't tolerate it without problems, whether that's digestive issues or cystic acne, this episode is going to go over how you can eventually tolerate dairy on a carnivore diet. A little disclaimer up front. Digestion and the human body are incredibly nuanced, so I can't say that this will work for everyone because there are many factors that go into health, like your age and how much damage your body has already been through. But most people are able to tolerate dairy eventually if you do carnivore for long enough and be mindful of how you phase it in. So why would you or wouldn't you want to include dairy in your carnivore diet? If you have been doing carnivore without dairy and you're doing great and you're perfectly happy and healthy without it, then fantastic. I don't think anyone necessarily needs to eat dairy on carnivore, and there are reasons not to include it. One of the most common pieces of advice that you see in carnivore groups online when someone says something like, hey, I've lost 30 pounds on carnivore, but I just can't seem to lose the last 10 pounds. Someone will always reply and say, are you eating dairy? Because if you are, try getting rid of it. I don't think that eating dairy necessarily means that you'll weigh more on carnivore, but I do know that a lot of people find dairy hard to control, and that's where it can get tricky. It's generally easier to overeat cheese than it is to overeat burger patties or chicken breast. Dairy products are definitely more palatable than meat in many ways, so it can be easy to overdo it, especially if you have a history of struggling with addictive behavior with food. Something that I want to address here that's a bit of a side note is that I've seen some discussion online saying that dairy products like cheese are literally addictive because the casein protein in dairy gets broken down during digestion into casomorphins, which is an opioid peptide. However, I've looked into this and there are quite a few studies that have demonstrated a lack of evidence to support this. There are many opioid peptides that are derived from food. Another example is rubiscolins, which comes from spinach leaves. I don't think that anyone says that spinach is addictive at all, but especially that spinach is addictive because of the opioids. It seems that cheese is more just highly palatable rather than addictive. There are certain taste experiences that make things delicious, such as fat, acid, salt, and umami. And many cheeses hit all of these things. Ultimately, only you know if cheese is something to avoid altogether because you find it hard to moderate, or if you're able to enjoy it just fine and find it worth eating. Which brings me to the positives for including dairy in your carnivore diet. The first thing that comes to mind is that from a compliance perspective, carnivore is much easier if you're able to include dairy. Not only does it open up more food choices, but it opens up food choices that tend to be more convenient than meat. But beyond that, even for meals, you're able to cook a larger variety of things if dairy is in the mix. And this can be especially important if you're trying to get your spouse or kids who aren't necessarily on board to eat more meat in general. Then outside the home, being able to have dairy can be hugely helpful for staying on the wagon at parties and social situations. Most events that you go to will have a cheese tray with some cubes of mozzarella or cheddar or Gouda. I've been to a lot of conferences and events with a social hour where there's no meat or charcuterie, presumably due to cost, but at least there's some cheese next to the fruit. So if you struggle with feeling left out at parties and events and it's not a context where you'd bring your own food, it can be nice to be able to have some dairy. Okay, so how do you go about tolerating dairy if it's something your body doesn't like right now? Let me start by sharing my history with dairy. I ate dairy pretty much my entire life until I had to give it up while breastfeeding my first child, which was about 5 years before I found carnivore. My son was vomiting constantly, and a nurse suggested that I try removing dairy from my diet. My son stopped vomiting immediately, so I gave it up for a year and a half while I was nursing him. And it's funny because before that, I always thought I tolerated dairy. Certainly ate it like I did, but I absolutely did not. I just didn't know it. It became obvious only through trial and error. Certain things like cystic acne, gas, and nasal congestion would go away whenever I stopped eating the dairy, and then when I started eating it again, they would always come back. So I more or less stopped eating it even after I weaned my son. So when I eventually found the carnivore diet in August of 2020, I didn't eat dairy. I did dairy-free carnivore because I was of the mindset that I did not tolerate it. Well, about a year and a half later, it was Lent, and there are days in that 40-day period where you abstain from meat. So if you're a carnivore and you're not eating dairy, then all you have left is fish and eggs. And I was like, I am sick of eggs and I am sick of fish. So I decided to try some dairy. First, I tried some butter, which is low in lactose, and it was completely fine. And then I had some hard cheeses like Parmesan and Manchego, which is a Spanish sheep's milk cheese. And again, no gas, no cystic acne, no congestion, nothing happened. And then I started to have some softer cheeses like fresh ricotta, mozzarella, cream cheese. Again, nothing happened. I had some yogurt, nothing happened. I was completely perplexed by this. I mentioned it at the time to a friend of mine and she was like, oh yeah, that happened to my mom when she went gluten-free. She was unable to tolerate dairy her whole life, but a year after she went gluten-free, she was able to tolerate dairy again. And then I met someone else who shared the exact same testimony. So that's when I decided it was time to research this. My understanding, based on what I found, my experience, and hearing the experiences of others, is that you can eventually tolerate dairy if the villi in your small intestine grow back. Villi are these finger-like projections that line your small intestine that play a huge role in the absorption and digestion of your food. And it is well established that certain compounds, such as gluten, damage the villi in your intestine. The condition of villus atrophy, where those finger-like projections erode away and nutrients cannot be absorbed properly into the body, is often noted in celiacs. The good news is that the villi are typically not permanently damaged, though the time it takes for the villi to return to normal varies person to person. Some reports I've seen say 3 to 6 months, some say a couple of years, and in some cases it seems to take longer than that. In one study I linked to, they looked at 381 adults with biopsy-proven celiac disease, and they did 2 follow-up biopsies at the 2-year mark and the 5-year mark, with the goal of figuring out what the rate of mucosal recovery is after following a gluten-free diet. At the 2-year follow-up, the biopsy showed that 1/3 of the patients demonstrated fully recovered intestinal villi. At the 5-year follow-up biopsy, 2/3 showed fully recovered intestinal villi. One thing to keep in mind here is that these are people going on gluten-free diets, not carnivore, which in theory, I would expect to be more powerful for facilitating healing of the gut, because there are other foods that damage the villi in the intestine, such as sugar. In one paper I linked to, they show images of the damage that high glucose does to the intestinal mucosa, and they note that oral high glucose leads to swelling and necrosis of individual intestinal villi. Necrosis is the medical term for the death of your body tissue. This is a rat study specifically, but there are many studies examining human subjects that demonstrate that sugar damages the gut. In a paper I've linked to titled Sugar and Gastrointestinal Health, they say that both hyperglycemia, which is a state of high blood sugar, and excessive sugar intake disrupt the intestinal barrier, thus increasing gut permeability and causing profound gut microbiota dysbiosis. For me, a 1.5 years of carnivore appeared to give me a sufficient enough gut healing that I can tolerate dairy without issue now. But as we've discussed, the time it might take for you is a big question mark, depending on specific factors unique to your body and your life. It is amazing to me that many people are eventually able to enjoy dairy again after the gut healing that carnivore typically brings for people. I love being able to enjoy this food group again. And I hope that if it's something you want to include but don't currently tolerate, that this serves as an extra motivation for you to keep going and eventually heal enough to get there. Subscribe to my channel to keep getting more episodes supporting the carnivore diet. And if you want to hear from me in between episodes with more studies, bonus articles, and motivation for staying on the carnivore diet, sign up for my email newsletter at www.theroadtocarnivore.com.